previous video, we provided a brief overview of the reading section for the TOEFL IBT. As we mentioned before, the length of each reading passage is around 700 words. There are 3 to 5 reading passages in total on the test, with 12 to 14 questions per passage. And the test can range anywhere from 60 to 100 minutes, depending on the number of passages you have to read. Now, since the TOEFL is a multiple choice test, I find it very helpful to provide an overview of the general test-taking strategy when it comes to multiple choice tests. So, in a way, it's often helpful to think about how test makers try to develop answers to guarantee that there is a correct answer to each question. So, we're going to take a look at a sample question. Now, this one is not from the TOEFL. In fact, it's fairly easy, but it will serve the purpose to illustrate just how multiple choice tests are usually constructed. Now, in this particular question, it might be very easy to see the answer right away. But first, let's use this to demonstrate the different parts of how a question is constructed. First off, the top part here, the question, oftentimes is also referred to as the prompt. The choices that you're given, collectively, are referred to as the answer stem. The right choice, of course, is called the answer. But the other choices are called distractors, and there's a reason for that. It's usually because if you have 4 to 5 choices, the test is trying to actually follow a particular pattern in order to distract you from the actual answer. So, for example, as we can see here, 1 is the answer, of course. And then 1 to 2 of the distractors that are listed here are completely wrong, which means that there is absolutely no hope that the answer could ever be right. However, it's the other distractors that often confuse students, because generally there are 1 to 2 distractors that look correct, except usually for some small problem. Now let's go back and demonstrate here with our sample question. Which one or ones do you see are completely wrong? Now again, the answer is fairly easy to see here, but try to understand my logic when trying to analyze how you could actually construct this answer choice. Because again, there has to be only one answer, and we don't want there to be any doubt. So in this case, if we had to eliminate which ones would be completely wrong, we would first start with B. B makes really no sense at this point. Which ones do we have left? Well, again, you probably could easily eliminate choices, but again, I want you to notice just how the test might try to trick you. So in this case, which one or ones look good, if only for some small problem? Well, for example, let's start with A. Now, of course, we usually don't use dates or days of the week when it comes to time, but sometimes somebody might say, what time is it? And the first response they might say, well, it's on Monday. So in this case, A could be acceptable, might be acceptable if somebody said on Monday, but that's probably not the best answer choice. So again, notice even for some small problem, it still might confuse. D, of course, can confuse someone, a general test taker, unless they recognize that, of course, this is a date and not a time. So again, what we're trying to just demonstrate here with this sample question are the different ways or the different levels of distractors that test makers use. So in this case, we could easily see the answer. So, this process that we went through, this process of analyzing which ones are completely wrong or which ones might be a little bit wrong, this is called the process of elimination. Now, in order to become a better test taker, I generally stress to students that you need to become a master of process of elimination. So, from now on, we're going to refer to it as POE. Now, one problem that students have is they often want to eliminate answer choices they don't understand, and that's actually a bad thing. We need to be confident in our POE choices. So if there's a choice that you don't know or understand, don't eliminate it first. We can only eliminate answer choices that we're certain are incorrect. Now, this kind of brings us to the idea that we shouldn't just choose the right answer first. Now, you may know what the right answer is, but just keep it for a moment. In this case, try to eliminate the other choices in order to make sure that you think you've got the right answer. Now, if you've reduced your choices to 2, and you have one choice that you know and one that you don't, I often tell a student to try both in the problem. So, try the one that you think works first. If it does seem to work, then that is probably going to be the answer. So even if you have two choices and one you don't know or one you don't understand, if the other one seems to make sense, then that's probably the best choice to make. But I do have to stress that process of elimination is not a 100% solution. Really, no test strategy is. The only way to improve your performance on the TOEFL is to improve your English. Now, in the previous video, we began discussing the general strategy of how to approach a reading passage on the test. If you recall, we stressed that you probably should not spend a lot of time reading the text at first. Instead, you should spend about 5 minutes reading through the introduction and all of the topic sentences, or the first sentences of each body paragraph, and then take a moment to skim the rest of the body, just to make sure you get the basic idea of the rest of the passage. Then in the next 15 minutes, this is when you should try to answer the questions. Now remember though, answering the questions often means going back to selectively read information when the question requires it. Then we also discussed that the different question types on the test, believe it or not, are actually designed to help you understand the text better. Now those 10 question types again are referred to under the general categories of details, inferences, vocabulary and reference, sentence level, and then the final questions referred to as read to learn. And again, remember, you will not see those questions until the end of the reading passage. In our video today, we're going to be looking at the detail questions. Now, just a quick hint before we get started. Each question type is going to require a different set of reading skills. So keep in mind that each question will probably require a different amount of time to answer it. Some question types will take longer. So you need to be sure, in order to be efficient, you know which question types are going to take which amount of time. The goal, of course, is we have to understand information quickly, because again, 20 minutes or so to read a passage and answer the questions, that's not a lot of time. So, the detail questions in general ask for you to look for specific pieces of information in the text. These type of questions require a much closer reading. So in this case, you're probably going to spend a little more time answering them. Because first, you have to scan the text to see where am I going to begin. Then you have to read the information carefully to identify the answer. Now, in the previous video, we had talked about reading and skimming. Scanning is a specific task or specific skill involves searching for specific pieces of information. So generally, looking at the question or prompt, it will tell us what to look for. Now, question type number 1 is referred to as finding factual information. These types of questions can be identified with the following language in the prompt, and we really need to pay attention to the language because it will help us quickly identify what type of question we're being asked. Detail questions usually refer to things such as looking at a particular paragraph, so for example, according to paragraph number and so on, or a sentence beginning with what is stated in the paragraph about something. And keep in mind, some detail questions may ask you to find more than one answer. This is a new feature on the TOEFL IBT that's different from the old paper-based version of the test. Now, once again, we are using the TOEFL Quick Prep download. The link you will be able to find at the bottom of the screen or under the video here on our YouTube channel. And please make sure you have taken some time to read and skim through the reading passage, because really in this video we're going to assume that you've already skimmed through it before. Now, the passage again was about the rise of Teotihuacán. Look at the questions following the reading passage. So take a moment and look at those and see if you can identify which ones appear to be those detail type 1 questions. Which ones seem to be looking for that factual information. Now again, I don't have all of the questions here on the screen. I did not place question 14 or 13 in this case. So part of it, of course, is very difficult to fit on the screen. So take a moment and read through the questions and see, can you identify which ones seem to be the detail questions? Okay, well, if you identified questions 10 and 11, you are correct. Now, how to solve these types of questions? Well, remember, they require a little more time because you're probably going to need to read the information a little more closely to solve that problem. Now, the test, of course, is giving you a little help. They're telling you where exactly to go and look for the text, so that's a good start. But oftentimes, they may not tell you exactly where in the paragraph to read. So the key is to use the prompt to tell you which paragraph to read, and then scan for that information that you're looking for. And we're going to do that right now. So in question number 10, let's look through the question. According to paragraph 4, what has recent research on obsidian tools found at Olmec sites shown? So again, notice in the prompt, we're immediately directed to the correct paragraph, which in this case is paragraph 4. But then they also indicate that we should look for something even more specific. The key words here, as we recognize, is focusing on recent research. So that's probably a good place to start. And then we notice, since the topic itself is discussing the rise of this civilization, often based on these types of obsidian tools, we need to be able to find what does it say about the tools found at these particular sites. Now, as you look through the answer choices, the first question to think about is there a way that the test is trying to trick us? Well, again, as we look through the paragraph, we need to recognize that, first off, in order to find this piece of information, we probably need to see where does it mention recent research or something similar to it. Again, from time to time, the TOEFL may not use the exact same wording in the paragraph. So we kind of have to look through and see, can we find something similar? Well, as we kind of scan through the text itself, I do notice that there is a mention of the exact same wording, recent research. So this looks like we probably need to start in the second half of the paragraph. And then notice some of the other language, obsidian tools and Olmec sites, do seem very close to the prompt itself. So that's pretty helpful when it comes to trying to solve the answer. Now, remember our general test strategy. Which choices can we eliminate first? Well, again, part of the idea is to think about how is the test trying to trick us? Well, again, if we go back to the general test strategy, we think about the idea that there are going to be answer choices that are going to distract us. So let's look through some of the ways that the TOEFL tries to distract us. First off, the correct answer itself is usually not the exact same words that we see in the text, but some sort of restatement or paraphrase of that information. So that's the first thing we need to recognize, that we should be careful of language that uses maybe the exact same words, especially with some of those bigger, more academic or even content words, technical terms, and so on. We should also be careful with distractors that include some of the idea, or includes information that looks possible but not actually mentioned in the text. And this is one that often really tricks students, because they often think about, well, it's possible, but they don't realize that if it's not mentioned in the text, we can't really trust it. And then, of course, there are certain things that students often confuse. For example, numbers. Numbers are often very difficult to understand. And if you notice in this particular reading, we have dates, and especially dates that are BC. So in this case, we need to recognize, are we talking about BC or AD, and how exactly do we distinguish between those? So again, sometimes if they use a particular number, this may not actually be the right answer, because oftentimes they're using the number in the wrong way. So in this case, take a look and see what are some ways that they're trying to trick us. Which ones may have partial information, which ones may use some of the exact same wording, which ones may even use numbers in a way that perhaps we can't quite figure out. Well, what we're going to do next is put the two pieces of information side by side. So as we go through to start finding the answer, so again, let's kind of begin where in the text. So recent research mentions that these tools found at these sites have shown that some of the obsidian obtained by the Olmecs originated near Teotihuacán. Now, that is the immediate sentence itself. Keep in mind that we might need to read the next sentence, but that also gives us a chance to be tricked. So, for example, let's go through and see if we can find some particular answer choices that might trick us. Well, for example, C really stands out. First off, because I do see a number, 400 BC. So, for example, the residents of Teotihuacan traded obsidian with the Olmecs as early as 400 BC. Well, let's go back for a moment and notice where the number is located. There's 400 BC here. So as I look back at the sentence, which is the sentence kind of before it, and even then it talks about the neighbors of this particular area. The hard volcanic stone, which is referring to the obsidian, was a resource that had been in great demand for many years, at least since the rise of the Olmecs. And it apparently had a secure market. So what's interesting here is that it does seem that Teotihuacan may have traded with the Olmecs, but we cannot verify that it actually occurred as early as 400 BC. In fact, it doesn't mention anything about the actual time frame when they began to trade, or they must have dealt with this particular commodity. So the first problem we recognize here is that the residents of Teotihuacan and the trading obsidians with the Olmecs as early as 400 BC cannot be verified here by the text. So in this case, we can eliminate this one. Okay, let's go back to the other choices, starting with A. Obsidian's value was understood only when Teotihuacan became an important city. Well, again, as we kind of read through and skim through the information, generally, if we see information that's kind of away from where we found the idea of the recent research, again, that's where we're kind of looking here. Well, where does it even mention the value of this obsidian? As we look through here, we can kind of notice that it does talk about these resources, and it does mention that the resource had been in great demand, but it doesn't necessarily say anything about the value was understood after Teotihuacan became an important city. It probably gave the city a particular competitive edge over its neighbors. But I think one of the tricks we're seeing here is the fact of the use of the word rich. In this case, the use of the word rich is not referring to money necessarily. It's referring to how much of something they had. So in this case, A might be true, but we can't seem to find any proof that its value was understood only then. And in fact, if we look at the sentence at the end, Teotihuacan obsidian must have been recognized as a valuable commodity for many centuries before the great city arose. So in this case, A is connecting to this piece of information after it, but it seems to get some of the information wrong. In other words, it kind of misstates the information. So we've eliminated A and C already. Okay, now let's look at our next answer choice, in B. The residents of Teotihuacan were sophisticated tool makers. Well, as we scan through the piece of information, do we see where it talks about the idea of them making tools? Well, again, it does mention in the actual sentence we're looking at that these tools were found at Olmec sites. And they seem to be originated near the city of Teotihuacan. So that's a very real possibility. The residents could have been sophisticated tool makers. But again, the question is, can we prove that from the reading? Well, at least at this point, it's mentioned tools. So why don't we keep this answer just for a moment? But we don't know necessarily that they were sophisticated. We don't see any other words that might necessarily have a similar meaning. Now let's look at D. Some of the obsidian used by the Olmecs came from the area around Teotihuacan. Well, we do mention that in terms of the obsidian used by the Olmecs, which we said here is found at the Olmec sites, and was obtained by the Olmecs, originated near Teotihuacan. This one, in this case, does not use the exact same words, but it uses words of similar meaning. They were used by the Olmecs. They came from this area. Well, again, used is very similar in a sense by the fact that they were obtained by the Olmecs, and came from is very similar to the idea of originated. This one seems to have some pretty strong text support in the reading. Is it possible that this one could be the answer? Well, in this case, it is the answer. And as we said before, one of the reasons we can recognize the answer is that it seems to get the information in the correct way. This obsidian was used by the Olmecs, and it came from the area around Teotihuacán. And again, part of the idea is it uses language that's very similar in meaning. So in this case, it appears that we have found the answer. But of course, it took a while. We had to go through the text and read it a lot more carefully than probably read it the first time, or skimmed through it the first time. So again, as we mentioned before, it uses some of the original wording, but not all of it. Well, again, it did mention obsidian and Olmecs, but it did use a lot more of those synonyms or synonymous ideas. Now let's look at question 11. In question 11, we're asked to answer the question by finding two answer choices. So again, this one's going to take a little more time. Now first off, where are we going to look? Well, paragraph 5 is what's mentioned in the reading. And then other key words we're looking for referring to immigrants. And the fact that they have been attracted to the city by certain features of the city. So what we need to find now is where in the paragraph does it mention immigrants or something similar. So looking over on the right side, as we scan through the information, we do notice that the first sentence mentions the residents, and then it mentions something about success attracting immigrants to the city. So it looks like we have found the place to begin. So the question is asking us what particular features attracted them. Well, remember, part of the idea of reading is that oftentimes the answer might be immediately before it and immediately after it. Well, in a future video, we're going to talk more about these kinds of words. But if you notice, in the sentence that actually contains the words immigrants, we do have a particular expression here that says such success. Now, first off, the question is such is referring to a type of success, but the question is what kind of success? If it's such success, where can we find that information? Well, in this case, we actually have to go backwards in the text. You see, the term such success is actually referring us to information that came before it. So first off, what type of success were they talking about? Well, if we notice that the trade in obsidian gave them access to a wide variety of exotic goods. So this trade seemed to give the residents of the city exotic goods, and also seemed to have given them a prosperous life. Well, that would certainly be one reason why you would attract people to the city. Notice the sentence that follows uses the words in addition. This information also kind of tells us that there is more that is coming, so that we need to continue to read. Well, it also seems that that particular set of residents, the elite, also tried to attract these new inhabitants. It is also probable that as early as 200 BC, they may have achieved some religious significance. And its shrine or shrines may have served as an additional population magnet. Finally, the population, again, was probably fed by the irrigated fields. So as we look through the text, it actually looks like there might be three reasons as to why immigrants may have come to the city. Number one, this long-distance trade gave them access to exotic goods, which helped produce a very good life. Number two, there may have been some particular religious reasons to draw this new population. And number three, it seems that the growing population probably enjoyed the food, the fields that were available. Well, now let's go to the answer choices themselves. First off, which ones can we easily eliminate? Well, even though it might seem like a logical answer, it doesn't seem that anywhere in the text did they talk about the fact that there was plenty of housing where people could live. It mentioned that there were inhabitants and immigrants and lots of success, but the text itself never mentions directly the idea of housing. So in this case, we could easily eliminate B just by looking at our answer choices. Let's go back up to A. Now again, notice again that we have to be able to recognize vocabulary. The prosperity of the elite. Well, prosperity is a word family member of the word prosperous. So notice it's not the exact same word, but it is a word that's similar. And we do mention that it's the prosperity of the elite, which in this case is correct based on the paragraph. So in this case, let's keep this one. Let's move on to C. Opportunities for well-paid agricultural employment. Well, where does it mention agriculture in the reading? Well, at the end of the paragraph, it does mention the idea of irrigated fields, but it doesn't necessarily mention anything about employment. Now, it might seem logical that people would want to come for good jobs, but instead it talked about the idea that agriculture was a great way to feed people, not necessarily an opportunity for employment. So it looks like we might be able to eliminate C. Moving on to D, it talked about the presence of one or more religious shrines. Well, once again, we go through and notice that religious significance and the shrine or shrines may have attracted different people. So D looks like a pretty good choice too. And remember, since the question is looking for two choices, we probably need to think about that the answer choices are going to be similar, but not exactly the same. So, which ones did we eliminate? Well, it looks like that we could probably eliminate thinking about B and C. And in this case, we could keep A and D. So, notice once again how the synonyms played a part. In this case, the word prosperity was linked or similar to the idea of success. We also notice that the word immigrants was not repeated throughout the text, but actually rephrased in several different ways. If you're an immigrant, you're new to the area, you're an additional population, and of course you add to the population by growing. So notice in this case we didn't repeat the word immigrants, we used similar words to rephrase that idea. So, those particular words that we talked about in terms of organization are referred to as signal words. Those words that help connect or link information. In a future video, we will spend a little more time talking about the idea of signal words and why it's so important to learn their meaning. But for now, you probably noticed words in this text, words like in addition or such. But other signal words can be words such as first and next and however. These are particular words we must pay attention to if we're going to understand how text is organized. So, in this case, as we noticed, those signal words, in addition, finally, these particular words helped to show us that a lot of the information was connected. We need to be able to pay attention to those words. Unfortunately, it's often very difficult to do that at the beginning when we're skimming through the information. It's only after we read it carefully that we can finally figure out what it's looking for. Now let's move on to the second type of a question, a detailed question, negative facts. Now the title here is a little misleading. The test is not looking for negative information, but rather information that is not directly stated in the reading. So in other words, the distractors in this question are actually true statements. You can actually find them in the text. But the answer they are looking for is actually false. And this is one that cannot be supported by the text. Now you might be able to even guess what strategy we're going to recommend. But the idea here is you're going to have to read that passage in order to understand it, just like we did for the previous one. But this time you're going to scan for true statements. And then only after you've eliminated the true statements, then the one that's left hopefully is the false one. Now, in the prompt, you can recognize negative fact questions with the following language. All are true except. Which of the following is not mentioned? So, looking at our answer choices again, which ones do you see talk about the fact that it's including all information except something, or that a particular answer choice is not mentioned? Well, scanning through the question choices, the questions we're going to be looking at briefly are questions 2 and 5. So, immediately in question 2, you will notice the word except. And of course, it also tells us, just like with the first detail question, where exactly to look in the text. So, for example, in paragraph 1, and then it mentions where specifically in paragraph 1. Something as a feature of the city in a certain time period. So there, once again, numbers are involved here, and that can be pretty confusing. Well, once again, putting the text and the question together, remember our goal here is to go through and eliminate answer choices that are actually true. So remember, scan for the true answers first, then eliminate them. Now that might seem easy, but again, sometimes students might get confused because they often think about what's logical rather than actually looking for the same information. So first off, let's see if we can find what does it mention as a feature between these dates. Again, dates can be confusing, but as we look through here, we can notice that starting with the second sentence, it mentions at its height between 150 and 700, it probably had. So in this case, this is probably the point to begin for the text, and then probably as we keep reading, we notice that there are no more dates that are presented. Now there are lots of numbers, but at this point it looks like that most of the reading is going to be between those dates anyway. So as we go through, let's see if we can find this information and see if we can eliminate it. So for example, does it mention something about regularly arranged streets? Well, again, we have to look and find information that is similar, maybe not necessarily the same. So take a moment and scan through and see if you can find it. If you can find it, then we can eliminate it. Well, if you notice in this particular sentence, it does mention a regular grid pattern of streets and buildings. So it does seem to be that there was a lot of planning going on in this city. So in this case, we can eliminate A. Okay, move on to B. Can we find something similar? Well, we do notice that it mentions an administrative center, but it does state that it's singular, not plural. Could that be a trick? Well, let's put a question mark next to it before we decide to either keep it or eliminate it. Next, many manufacturing workshops. Okay, well, as we go through the text, we see that instead of many, they use the word large number, which is basically the same. Instead of manufacturing, they use industrial, which again is basically the same. And of course, they do say that it is a workshop or workshops. So perhaps we can feel confident that C doesn't make sense. Okay, finally, let's look for apartment complexes. Well, again, in the sentence, the same sentence, it mentioned that it had over 2,000 apartment complexes. So in this case, D also seems to be present. I think we can safely think at this point that B is the answer, largely because what we're looking for is something singular, not plural. Now, it's a fine, small trick, but it's one that really requires us to read the information carefully. And also remember those answer choices that we looked at, they may have that synonymous language. So even as we noticed here in this particular reading, they didn't always use the exact same words. We have to be able to eliminate even based on that idea. Now let's look at question 5. So again, it tells us where to read, paragraph 2, and it does mention the factor in the development of the city. So again, the idea is to figure out which particular piece of information is not present. Well, scan once again in paragraph 2. Where should we begin? Well, if you notice in the prompt, it mentions main factor. In the question itself, it does mention the idea of among the main factors. So it seems as if when we say the main factors, we're probably going to get a list of factors that are going to follow. So once again, this is the place to begin in the text, and then we probably need to continue to read and begin to eliminate. So again, what we're looking for is information that we can find in the text so that we can eliminate it. So let's start with A. The presence of obsidian in the Teotihuacán Valley. Well, we do notice that it mentions the obsidian resources in the valley itself. That would pretty much seem to eliminate it. Let's move on to B, the potential for extensive irrigation of Teotihuacán Valley lands. Well, again, we notice that it mentions the valley's potential for extensive irrigation as among one of those main factors. So that would also seem to be one that we could eliminate. Look at C, a long period of volcanic inactivity. Well, does it mention a volcano in the reading? See if you can find it. Well, we notice the word volcano is mentioned here at the bottom. But let's look at it a little more carefully. As we go back, it says, to that original sentence, it's a fairly long sentence. The exact role of other factors is much more difficult to pinpoint. For example, their religious significance. So, was that a particular factor? How did it play a role? The ability of the elite, their ingenuity and foresightedness, so in other words, how progressive they were. And finally, what about those natural disasters? For example, it mentions the volcanic eruptions of the late 1st millennium BC. Well, in the actual answer choice, it mentions the period of inactivity. But in the reading, it seems like that these volcanoes had been erupting and did produce some kind of potential disaster. So, in this case, let's put a question mark next to this one and come back to it. Okay, the last answer choice mentions its location on a trade route. Well, back up to the top, when it mentions those main factors, it does mention its geographical location on a natural trade route to the south. That would seem pretty much to be the same as the wording in D. In this case, C does appear to be the correct answer. Even though we see the same words, we notice that it does not actually state what's in the text. Here, it mentions the volcano had been inactive, but in the text, it said that the volcanoes had been erupting. So, our final thoughts on this particular part of the test. Detail questions ask you to scan for specific pieces of information, to read before and after, to be a little more careful and try to understand that information and how they connect. So again, notice it did take us a little while to read through that information. Now, of course, we were explaining the information too, and we're really talking more about test preparation at this point. Obviously, you're going to have to move much more quickly in the reading in order to find the answer. Type 1 factual information questions, remember they ask you to find the answer choice that's basically using the same idea, but oftentimes with similar or synonymous language, instead of words that often may be exactly the same. Type 2 negative factual questions also ask you to eliminate the true answer choices to find the one that is false. As we learned in the videos, some common TOEFL tricks involve answer choices that may often contain exact wording. Sometimes that can be a trick. Probably the most difficult is using answer choices that get some of the information correct but not all of it. And that's probably one of the most difficult for students to eliminate. And of course, answer choices that get the order of information wrong, or that misrepresents information from the text. So for example, ones that use numbers but in a confusing or wrong way. So again, that's also very difficult for students to understand. Finally, signal words, those words that help show how information is organized, are going to play a very important part. They help to indicate how the entire passage is organized, how a paragraph is organized, and oftentimes how even one sentence or idea connects to another. We will spend more time talking about this in a future video. So in this next video coming up, you will see that we will take more time to help us understand how signals work. Once again, it's important to mention that there are lots of great preparation materials available for the TOEFL. Again, a lot of the free information, including the information that's dissected in this video, comes from the TOEFL website. But I would also recommend the official guide to the TOEFL test published by ETS through McGraw-Hill. We also have a new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, in which the link can be found at the bottom of this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 3, Signal Words and Inference Questions.